Hello and welcome back to another evening together. It's good to have you here again. Get comfortable, dim whatever lights you've still got on, and let's settle in for a long, quiet one. Tonight we're going to do something I've been wanting to do for a while now. We're going to go through every single season of Dexter, all 8 of them, and we're going to rank them from the worst to the best. Now, I want to be careful with that word, worst, because it carries a bit more weight than it deserves here. When I say worst, I don't mean bad. I mean the one that, when you line all 8 up next to each other, ends up at the bottom of the pile. And as we'll see when we get there, even the bottom of the Dexter pile is a place a lot of other shows would be thrilled to live. So this isn't a takedown. It isn't me sharpening my knives and going after a show I'm secretly tired of. It's the opposite, really. You don't sit and rank all 8 seasons of something unless you've spent a genuinely embarrassing amount of your life with it. And I have. So have you, probably, or you wouldn't be here at 1 in the morning listening to me talk about a forensic analyst with a very specific hobby. Here's how tonight's going to work. We're going to count up, starting at number 8 and working our way to number 1. Each season gets its own proper chunk of time. I'm not going to rush any of them, even the ones near the bottom, because honestly, the ones near the bottom are often the most interesting to talk about. It's easy to gush about the great seasons. It's a bit more fun to sit with the ones that didn't quite come together and figure out why. There's no big reveal coming, no shocking twist at the end where I tell you the worst season is secretly the best. It's just the 2 of us, going season by season, having the kind of conversation you'd have with a mate who's seen the show as many times as you have. I should say as well, there's no pressure to stay awake for all of it. That's sort of the point. If you drift off somewhere around season 5, that's a job well done as far as I'm concerned. Each section stands on its own, so it doesn't matter where you fall asleep or where you tune back in. You won't miss some crucial piece that the whole thing hinges on. There isn't one. It's just a long, calm walk through a show we both like. If you do enjoy this sort of thing and you want more of it, there's a subscribe button down there somewhere, and it does genuinely help. But that's the only time I'll mention it for a while, so don't worry about it. For now, get yourself settled and let's start at the bottom and work our way up. Before we start the actual countdown, I want to lay out the lens I'm using because every ranking is really just one person's lens and it's only fair to show you mine up front. The way I think about it is this: a season's spot on the list isn't really about how good its individual moments were. Almost every season of Dexter has at least one scene that could go toe-to-toe with the best of them. What I'm actually ranking is the gap between what a season was trying to do and how well it pulled it off. Ambition versus execution. Some seasons reached for something enormous and landed it cleanly. Some reached for something enormous and sort of fumbled it on the way down. And some played it safe and did exactly what they set out to do. No more and no less. All of that goes into where a season ends up. And here's the thing that makes Dexter unusually easy to talk about in this way. The quality of the show tracks almost perfectly with who was running it behind the scenes. The first 4 seasons were overseen by a showrunner named Clyde Phillips, and those 4 are, broadly speaking, the good ones. Then Phillips left, and a man named Chip Johannesson steered a single transitional season on his own. After that, Scott Buck took the wheel for the final 3. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the seasons most people argue about, the ones that tend to end up lower on lists like this one, mostly fall into that last stretch. It's not that anyone set out to make a worse show. It's that a long-running story lives or dies on whether someone at the top has a clear, steady idea of what it's actually about. When that idea is sharp, the show sings. When it gets fuzzy, you can feel it. I'll come back to that idea more than once tonight because it's the quiet thread running underneath the whole list. But I don't want to make it sound like I'm only here to grumble about the back half. The truth is, I have a lot of affection for nearly all of this, even the seasons that lost the plot a bit. Michael C. Hall holds the entire thing together from the first frame to the last, and there's never a season where he stops being worth watching even when the writing around him wobbles. It might also help to name the basic shape every season follows, since it's the same template stretched in 8 different directions. Each year, the show introduces a major new antagonist, a so-called Big Bad, whose presence forces Dexter to confront some particular aspect of himself. The brother forces the question of blood and belonging. The friend forces the question of whether the code can be shared. The family man forces the question of whether Dexter can have a real life, and so on. Around that central duel, each season runs a more ordinary police procedural engine, with Miami Metro investigating crimes of the week, some of which Dexter quietly hijacks for his own purposes. And threaded through all of it are flashbacks to his childhood, to Harry's training, filling in the psychology a piece at a time. Once you see that structure, you see it everywhere. And part of what separates the strong seasons from the weak ones is simply how well the big bad of a given year actually illuminates something true about Dexter, rather than just providing a body count. The best villains are the ones who hold up a mirror. The weaker ones are the ones who are merely dangerous. So keep that in mind as we go. Wherever a season lands, it's still Dexter. It's still that strange, lonely, oddly funny show about a man trying to do a monstrous thing carefully. With all that said, let's go to the bottom of the list. Actually, before we go to number 8, let me linger for just a moment on the thing all 8 of these seasons are built on, because it's worth saying out loud, and it makes the rest of the night easier to follow if you've drifted in and out. It also gives us a gentle place to settle before the countdown proper. The whole show rests on one idea, and it's a genuinely strange one when you say it plainly. The main character is a serial killer, and you're meant to like him. Not tolerate him, not be morbidly fascinated by him, but actually root for him, want him to get away with it, feel relief when he does. That's a very odd thing to ask of an audience, and most shows that tried it would collapse under the weirdness of it within an episode or two. Dexter pulls it off, and it pulls it off mainly through 2 things working together. The first is the voiceover, that constant interior narration that lets you live inside Dexter's head, so that even when his actions are monstrous, his reasoning is laid out for you in this dry, almost endearing way. The second is the code. The code is the load-bearing wall of the entire series, so it's worth being clear about what it is. When Dexter was a boy, his adoptive father, Harry, a Miami cop, realized that the child he'd taken in had something deeply wrong with him, a compulsion, an emptiness where other people have feelings, and an appetite for killing that wasn't going to go away. And rather than try to cure it, which Harry seems to have understood was impossible, he decided to channel it. He taught Dexter a set of rules: don't get caught above all, and only kill people who genuinely deserve it, people who've done terrible things and slipped through the cracks of the justice system Harry spent his life serving. Murderers who got off, predators the law couldn't touch. The code turns Dexter from a random monster into something the show can let you cheer for, a kind of dark filter on his nature that points it mostly at other monsters. And nearly every season is, underneath its specific plot, a test of that code. Each villain, each relationship, each crisis pokes at it from a different angle. What happens when someone wants to use the code for their own ends? What happens when someone Dexter loves finds out about it? What happens when Dexter wants something the code won't allow, like a real friendship, or a family, or peace? The seasons are essentially 8 different experiments asking the same question, which is whether a man can live inside a set of rules designed to manage the unmanageable, and whether those rules are protecting him or slowly strangling the life he actually wants. There's one more thing worth holding on to about the code, which is that it's both a gift and a cage, and the show is wonderfully ambivalent about which it is at any given moment. On the one hand, the code is the only reason Dexter has a life at all. Without Harry's rules, he'd have been caught or self-destructed or become something even worse decades ago. The code gives him structure, purpose, a way to exist among people without being a pure danger to all of them. It's the closest thing to love Harry knew how to offer a son like that, a set of instructions for survival. But on the other hand, the code is also a leash, and a fairly grim one because it presumes that Dexter can never be anything other than what he is. It doesn't try to make him better, it just tries to make him safe. And across the series, you can feel Dexter occasionally straining against that, wondering whether the rules that protect him are also the thing keeping him from a fuller, freer, more human life. Is he being saved by the code or simply contained by it? The show never fully answers, and that ambiguity is part of what keeps it interesting for 8 years. And one last bit of furniture before we start, because it'll help to have the names in your head as they come up. Around Dexter sits a small, recurring cast we'll keep bumping into. There's Deborah, his adoptive sister, a homicide detective, foul-mouthed and fierce, and the person he loves most. There's Hell Batistu, a warm, decent detective who's probably the closest thing Dexter has to an uncomplicated friend. There's Vince Muzuku, the lab's resident source of crude comic relief, who's more loyal and more human than his jokes suggest. There's Logware, ambitious and political, and a better investigator than people give her credit for. And there's the ghost of Harry, always hovering at the edge of Dexter's vision, voicing the code. These people are the steady backdrop against which every season's villain comes and goes, and part of the pleasure of the show is watching the same little ensemble weather storm after storm together. Right. Now, properly this time, let's go to number 8. So we begin at the bottom, and the bottom, for me and for most people who've thought about this, is the 8th and final season. The one that had to land the plane. And, well, you know how that went. Let me set the scene for what this season was actually trying to do, because it helps to be fair to it before we get into where it goes wrong. Season 8 arrives in the aftermath of Deborah having shot and killed Laguertu to protect Dexter, which is about as heavy a place to start a season as you could possibly pick. Deborah is shattered, she's left the police force, she's working private security, she's drinking, she's spiraling, and she can barely look at her brother. And into all of this walks a new character, a neuropsychiatrist named Dr. Evelyn Vogel, played by Charlotte Rampling. Vogel turns out to be the person who actually helped Harry design the code all those years ago. She calls Dexter her perfect psychopath, like he's a project she's proud of. And that, on paper, is a genuinely brilliant idea. The whole show has rested on Harry's code, this set of rules Dexter's lived by his entire adult life. And now we learn Harry didn't come up with it alone. Someone was in the room. Someone shaped the thing that shaped Dexter. That's a lovely, unsettling place to take a final season. And yet, for all that promise, the execution is where it comes apart. The season pairs Vogel with a new killer, the brain surgeon, who's removing pieces of his victims' brains and leaving them around like little gifts. And the mystery of who the brain surgeon is never really catches fire the way the great Dexter villains did. It plods. It connects back to Vogel in ways that feel more like plot machinery than genuine surprise. And meanwhile, the emotional engine of the season, which is Deborah's grief and her slow attempt to find her way back to her brother, keeps getting interrupted by a thriller plot that nobody's especially gripped by. To be fair, Jennifer Carpenter does extraordinary work in this season. Deborah hitting rock bottom is some of the rawest material she ever got to play, and she plays it without a single false note. There's a stretch early on where Deborah is so far gone, so consumed by what she did, that watching it is genuinely uncomfortable in the way the show wanted it to be. So it's not as if the season has nothing, it has her. The problem is the show keeps pulling away from the one thing that's working to service a villain plot that isn't. Now let's talk about the ending, because there's no ranking this season, honestly, without it. And it's the single biggest reason it sits dead last. Deborah is shot by the brain surgeon, and after seeming like she might pull through, she suffers a stroke and is left without meaningful brain function. Dexter goes to the hospital, disconnects her life support himself, carries her body out, and takes her out to sea on his boat to bury her in the water. The same water where he's dumped so many of the people he killed. And then, with a hurricane bearing down on Miami, he drives his boat directly into the storm in what is plainly meant to read as a suicide. The wreckage is found, he's presumed dead. And then, in the final minutes, We cut to a remote logging town, somewhere cold and gray and far from Miami. And there is Dexter, alive, with a beard, working as a lumberjack. He looks up at the camera and the show ends. I've sat with that ending many times over the years, and I want to be careful here because it would be easy to just pile on. In any real version of this story, a man does not survive driving a boat into a hurricane on purpose and turn up perfectly intact 1,000 miles away with a new career in forestry. But the logic isn't even really the issue. Plenty of shows ask you to swallow a tall tale in the finale. The issue is what the ending says. Dexter chooses to exile himself, to deny himself any version of happiness, to leave his own son with Hannah and vanish because he believes he destroys everyone he loves. And the show seems to agree with him. It punishes him, and in doing so, it quietly abandons the more interesting and more honest question the whole series had been circling, which is whether a man like this could ever actually be happy and whether he'd deserve it if he were. Instead of answering that, it just sends him off to chop wood alone forever. It's a strangely cowardly note for such a bold show to go out on. The numbers tell their own version of this story, by the way. Critically, this season hit the lowest point of the entire run, and the finale itself has become a kind of shorthand for disappointing television endings. People genuinely talk about it in the same breath as the most divisive series finales ever made. And yet, here's the part that always fascinates me. The audience didn't abandon the show on the way out. The season 8 premiere was, at the time, the most watched episode Dexter had ever aired. People showed up in enormous numbers to see how this thing ended. The heartbreak of the finale isn't the heartbreak of a show nobody cared about limping to a close. It's the heartbreak of a show millions of people loved fumbling the catch at the very last second. And that, honestly, is sadder. There's a fun detail about Vogel that I think is worth sitting with, because it shows how good the idea underneath this season really was. She doesn't react to Dexter the way anyone else ever has. Everyone in his life either doesn't know what he is or once they find out, recoils from it. Vogel knows exactly what he is from the first conversation, and she's delighted. She isn't frightened, she isn't disgusted, she looks at him the way a scientist looks at an experiment that worked. She talks about psychopaths not as broken people, but as a different kind of person entirely, one society needs more than it admits. And for a little while, that gives the season a genuinely fresh flavor, because for the first time, Dexter has someone in his life who sees the whole of him and approves. Not a partner in the work like some of the others, but something closer to a proud parent looking at a job well done. Charlotte Rampling plays her with this cool, unbothered intelligence that's lovely to watch. It's a shame the plot she's attached to couldn't keep pace with the character. There's also a thread I think is worth pulling on because it's one of the season's better ideas even if it gets cut short. Dexter encounters a young man named Zach Hamilton who is unmistakably a budding killer. And rather than simply putting Zach on the table, Dexter, partly at Vogel's encouragement, considers something he's never really tried before: mentorship. He starts to wonder whether he could do for Zach what Harry did for him. Teach the boy a version of the code, point his darkness at people who deserve it, give him the leash that Dexter himself was given. It's a fascinating idea because it puts Dexter in Harry's chair for the first time, forces him to look at his own nature from the outside, in the form of someone younger and rawer. For a little while, you can see Dexter genuinely moved by the possibility of passing something on, of not being entirely alone in what he is. The show, sadly, doesn't let the thread breathe for long, but the idea behind it, Dexter as teacher, Dexter as a kind of father to his own monstrousness, is one of the more thoughtful things the final season reaches for. The other thing happening this season in the background is the business of getting Dexter's life into position for an exit. There's talk of a new life somewhere far away. In Argentina, the three of them, Dexter and Hannah and Harrison, leaving Miami and the whole double life behind for good. And I actually quite like the idea of that as a destination because it's the closest the show ever came to letting Dexter genuinely imagine a future, a real one, with a family and a horizon and no kill table waiting. The tragedy of the season, in the end, is how close that future gets before it's snatched away. You can almost see it. The plane tickets, more or less, are bought. And then it all comes apart. I'll also give the season a small, fond nod for the way it tends to its supporting players on the way out. Quinn spends the season chasing a promotion and chasing Deborah in his slightly hapless way. And there's something sweet about watching this character who started as a bit of a loose cannon, just wanting by the end to be settled and chosen. And Masuku, of all people, gets a lovely little arc where a daughter he never knew he had turns up in his life. It's a small, warm thread in a heavy season, and the show is generous enough to give him it. These aren't the reasons the season ranks where it does, but they're reasons to be kind to it, and I try to be. And there's a melancholy that hangs over the whole season that I don't think is entirely intentional, but that gives it a strange poignancy on a rewatch. You can feel that everyone involved knows it's the end. The Miami Metro we've spent years with, Batistu thinking about retiring and opening a restaurant, the old familiar bullpen, the desks and the lab and the rhythms of the place, it's all winding down. Whatever you think of the plotting, there's something genuinely affecting about watching a world you've lived inside for years quietly pack itself up. The last season of any long-running show carries this weight, this sense of last times, even when you're not told outright that it's a last time. And season 8, for all its faults, has that in spades. It's an ending even in the moments where it isn't trying to be. And that lends a sadness to it that sits oddly alongside its more obvious problems. I find myself oddly tender toward it for that reason, the way you might be tender toward the final evening of a long holiday, even one that didn't entirely go to plan. I've thought a fair bit about what would have made that ending land better, not to redesign the show, but because it's a useful way to understand why the one we got disappoints. The bones of something powerful are right there. A man who believes he poisons everyone he touches, choosing exile to spare the people he loves, is a genuinely tragic idea. The problem is the execution undercuts it at every turn. The lumberjack reveal plays less like a deliberate, devastating choice and more like the show hedging its bets, keeping Dexter alive just in case, refusing to fully commit to either his death or his redemption. An ending that had let him truly die or truly find some hard-won peace would have honored the 8 years we'd put in. Instead, we got a man staring at a camera in a snowy room, in a sense that the story hadn't ended so much as trailed off. And that, more than any single plot hole, is what people mean when they talk about being let down. It isn't that the ending was confusing, it's that it felt like a flinch. So that's number 8. Not a worthless season. It has Jennifer Carpenter doing career best grief work. It has a genuinely clever idea buried in the Vogel reveal. It has a future for Dexter that you can almost taste before it's taken away. And it has an audience that never stopped caring. But it's a season that took the most precious thing a final season has, which is the ending, and did the one thing the story could not afford. It blinked, and so it sits at the bottom of the list. Less because it's bad and more because it had the most to lose and lost it. I don't watch it angrily anymore, for what it's worth. These days, I watch it more wistfully than anything, thinking about the version of this ending that might have been. Now, let's talk a little about Season 6, which sits one rung up from the bottom, and I find this one genuinely interesting to discuss, because it's a season that fails in a much more specific and almost more frustrating way than Season 8 did. Season 8 fumbled the ending. Season 6 fumbled the middle, the build, the whole spine of its story, and then redeemed itself almost entirely in its final 30 seconds. It's a strange shape for a season to have. The premise this time is religion. The big villain is the Doomsday Killer, who turns out to be a man named Travis Marshall, played by Colin Hanks. Travis stages these enormous, elaborate murder tableaus based on imagery from the Book of Revelation. Bodies arranged into scenes of the apocalypse, that sort of thing. The visuals, I'll give the season this, are some of the most striking the show ever produced. There's a real grim artistry to the crime scenes, and Travis is working under the influence of his old college professor, a man named Geller, played by Edward James Olmos, who appears to be the true zealot driving the whole thing, the mastermind pulling Travis along into darkness. And here's where the season makes its big mistake, and I think you probably already know what's coming if you've seen it. Geller isn't real, he's a hallucination. Travis has been doing all of it himself, and the menacing professor he keeps deferring to is a figure that exists only in Travis's broken mind, in the exact same way that Dexter spends the whole series talking to a hallucination of his dead father, Harry. It's meant to be a devastating twist. The problem is that an enormous chunk of the audience worked it out roughly halfway through the season, if not earlier. The clues weren't planted with the care a twist like this needs. Geller never quite interacts with the physical world in a way that can't be explained away. People notice these things, and once you've guessed the twist, you spend the back half of the season watching the show act like it's holding a secret you've already opened. In any real version of this investigation, by the way, Miami Metro would have figured out a great deal of this far earlier than they do. But we'll get to Miami Metro's investigative talents another time, because that's a whole video on its own, and it's far too funny to rush. To be fair to the season, there are things in it I do like. The exploration of faith and whether a man like Dexter could ever believe in anything bigger than himself is a worthy thing for the show to chew on. Dexter spends the season quietly wondering whether his son Harrison should be raised with religion, whether there's something there he himself is missing, and those small domestic moments are some of the season's better material. And Colin Hanks does what he can with Travis, who is at least a more sympathetic and frightened kind of villain than the show usually offers. He's not a monster relishing his work, he's a scared, lost man being driven by something inside himself he doesn't understand. And here's a part of season 6 I think gets unfairly forgotten in all the grumbling about the Geller twist, and it's the bit I'd actually point to if someone asked me to defend the season at all. Early on, Dexter crosses paths with a man called Brother Sam, an ex-convict and former killer who's found religion and now runs a car body shop, employing other men trying to leave hard lives behind. Dexter is sure it's an act. He's convinced Brother Sam is hiding the same darkness he hides, just dressed up in scripture, and he watches him, waiting for the mask to drop. And it never does. Brother Sam turns out to be exactly what he claims to be, a genuinely changed man who found something to hold on to. The two of them develop this quiet, unlikely friendship, and when Brother Sam is later attacked and dying, the conversation they have is one of the most genuinely affecting things in the back half of the whole series. It's about faith and forgiveness and whether a person can ever really outrun what they were. Mos Def, who plays him, is wonderful in it. That thread alone is worth the price of admission, and it's the strongest argument that season 6 had real ideas in it, even if the main plot couldn't carry them. I'll give the season its due on the look of it as well, because visually it's one of the most ambitious years the show ever attempted. The doomsday tableaus are genuinely striking, these grand, grotesque, painterly arrangements pulled from Revelation, a body posed as one of the 4 horsemen, fruit and angels and fire, all staged with a care that's almost beautiful before you remember what you're looking at. There's a real grandeur to the imagery that the earlier, grittier seasons never reached for. The trouble, and it's the season's trouble in a nutshell, is that the spectacle outran the substance. All that elaborate staging is in service of a mystery that didn't hold together. So the visuals end up feeling like a gorgeous frame around a picture that isn't quite finished. But the craft was there. Someone clearly cared a great deal about how the season looked, and on a purely visual level it delivers. And Travis himself, for all that his storyline fumbles, is at least a different flavor of antagonist, a frightened follower rather than a confident predator, a man who's as much a victim of his own delusion as anyone he harms. There's a sadness to him that's worth something, even when the plot around him isn't working. It's also worth saying that the domestic side of this season, Dexter as a single father to a growing Harrison, is sweeter and more lived in than it often gets credit for. Harrison's a proper little boy now, full of questions, getting into scrapes, asking about God and death in the blunt way small children do. And Dexter genuinely doesn't know how to answer him. There's a tenderness to watching this man, who understands killing far better than he understands parenting, fumble through bedtime and birthday parties and the terrifying, ordinary business of raising a child. The religious questions Harrison raises are part of what sends Dexter down the season's whole line of thinking about faith, which I rather like because it grounds a big abstract theme in something as small and real as a child asking where people go when they die. There's also a quieter institutional story humming along underneath everything, which is Deborah getting promoted. She's bumped up to lieutenant, partly through LaGuertu's political maneuvering, and she spends the season deeply uncomfortable in a job she didn't ask for and isn't sure she wants. I've always liked watching Deborah wrestle with authority because she's such a blunt, instinctive, swearing in the hallway sort of cop, and putting her behind a desk and making her play office politics rubs her completely the wrong way. It's a small thing, but it's the kind of character texture that keeps a wobbly season watchable between the bigger swings. I do want to be fair about what the Geller twist was reaching for, even though it didn't work because the ambition behind it was sound. The idea of a man being led into atrocity by a mentor who turns out to be a projection of his own broken mind is a genuinely rich one. It speaks to how people rationalize the monstrous things they do, how they invent authorities to blame, voices that gave the orders so they don't have to face that the cruelty came from inside them all along. And it rhymes deliberately with Dexter's own relationship to Harry, that imagined father who voices the code. The difference being that Harry steadies Dexter while Geller drove Travis off a cliff. There's a real thematic conversation in there about the stories we tell ourselves to make our worst impulses bearable. The tragedy of season 6 is that the execution couldn't carry the idea. The twist was guessable, the pacing was slack, and the religious symbolism often tipped into the lurid rather than the meaningful. But I never want to leave the impression that the season had nothing on its mind. It had quite a lot on its mind. It just couldn't quite say it. After a full season of a mystery plot that mostly didn't work, Dexter finally corners Travis in a church and kills him on a makeshift altar in his full ritual, plastic and all. And she sees him. She sees her brother standing over a body, knife in hand, in the unmistakable pose of a man who has done this many, many times before. That's it. That's the moment the entire series had been circling for 6 years. The one person Dexter loves most in the world, the sister who has defended him and depended on him and built her whole sense of safety around him, walks in and catches him in the act. And the season ends right there, on her face. I've gone back to that ending more than once, and it still works. It still lands. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most important single moments in the show's entire history, because it changes everything that comes after it. Everything from season 7 onward exists because of that open door. And so you have this odd situation where a season that's genuinely one of the weakest in execution ends on one of the strongest beats in the series. It's like watching someone tell a long, rambling story that you've half stopped paying attention to, and then they land the final line so perfectly that you forgive the whole thing. Almost, not entirely, which is why it's still down here at number 7. A great final 30 seconds can't fully carry 11.5 hours of television, but it can lift a season off the very bottom, and that's exactly what it does here. That's the bottom 2 behind us, which feels like a natural place to pause for a breath. If you're still with me and you're enjoying having this on, a quick subscribe genuinely helps these longer videos find the people who like falling asleep to them. No pressure at all. Right, let's get into the middle of the pack, where things start getting a lot harder to separate. So we've reached the point where this gets difficult because from here on up, we're mostly into seasons I actually really like, and the gaps between them get thinner and thinner. Number 6 on the list is season 3. And the interesting thing about season 3 is that it's the weakest of the 4 seasons made under Clyde Phillips, The Good Era, and yet it would comfortably beat both of the seasons we've already talked about. That's how strong that early run is. The worst of the great years still outclasses the troubled ones. Here's the setup. The season opens with Dexter doing something he almost never does, which is making a genuine mistake. He goes after a target in the dark, gets jumped, and kills a man in self-defense who turns out to be Oscar Prado, the brother of a rising and very well-connected assistant district attorney named Miguel Prado. And rather than this leading to Dexter's downfall, it leads to something far stranger. Miguel, played by Jimmy Smits, takes a liking to Dexter. The two men grow close, and slowly, over the course of the season, Miguel works out what Dexter really is, and instead of recoiling, he wants in. He wants to be part of it. He wants a partner, and that's the real subject of this season when you strip everything else away. It's about friendship. It's about whether Dexter, a man who has spent his entire life convinced he can only ever perform human connection rather than feel it, could actually let another person all the way in. For a while, Miguel seems like the answer to a question Dexter didn't even know he was asking. Here's someone who knows what he is and doesn't run. Here's someone he doesn't have to pretend around. You can see Dexter cautiously, almost shyly, starting to believe he might have found a true friend. Of course, it doesn't last because it can't. Miguel turns out to be exactly the wrong kind of student. He takes Harry's code, which is a set of restraints designed to point Dexter's darkness at people who genuinely deserve it, and he treats it as a license. He starts killing people who are simply inconvenient to him. Professional rivals, people who've crossed him. The code in Miguel's hands becomes a justification for ordinary, selfish murder, and Dexter realizes he hasn't found a friend at all. He's created a problem. And he has to clean it up, which he does, eventually killing Miguel and framing another criminal for it. I think Jimmy Smits is the reason this season works as well as it does, and I don't think that's a controversial thing to say. He brings a warmth and a charm to Miguel that makes the friendship genuinely believable, which is essential because if you don't buy that Dexter would let this man close, none of it lands. Smits makes you buy it. He's charismatic and likable right up until the moment he isn't. And the turn from friend to threat is handled with real skill on his part. And yet, around that central relationship, the season is a bit uneven. There's a subplot involving a killer called the Skinner who flays his victims and leaves them where they'll be found. And it never quite reaches the heights of the show's better villain arcs. It feels at times like it's there to give Deborah something to do while the real story plays out elsewhere. That said, Deborah's half of the season is more interesting than it gets credit for. She's chasing a promotion to detective, properly chasing it, trying to prove herself on her own merits rather than as Harry Morgan's daughter. And the show lets her be ambitious and prickly and a little insecure all at once. She also gets tangled up with a confidential informant named Anton. And that relationship is one of the more grounded, genuinely sweet things Deborah ever gets, at least for a while. Watching her try to be soft with someone when softness clearly doesn't come naturally to her is lovely. The Skinner subplot does eventually find some real stakes, to be fair to it, precisely because it collides with that Anton relationship. The Skinner is hunting for information, and Anton gets caught up in it, abducted and tortured, which suddenly makes the whole thread personal for Deborah in a way it wasn't before. It's a familiar move for the show, threatening someone a character loves to raise the temperature. But it works well enough here, and it gives Deborah a genuine fear to play rather than just procedural box ticking. I still think the Skinner himself is fairly forgettable as Dexter villains go, a means to an end rather than a fully realized figure. But the emotional fallout around him lands better than the character deserves. And it keeps Deborah's storyline from feeling completely disconnected from the season's heart, which is a danger in a year where the main event is so squarely Dexter and Miguel. There's also a small, quiet thread in this season that I find more moving than anything in the main plot, and that's Camilla. Camilla is an old colleague and family friend, someone who knew Harry, someone who's been part of the furniture at Miami Metro for as long as Dexter can remember, and she's dying slowly and painfully of cancer. and she asks Dexter, who she knows has a certain comfort around death that she can't quite name, to help her go, to give her the perfect slice of key lime pie she's been chasing her whole life, and then to end her suffering. And he does. It's a mercy, not a murder, completely outside the code. And it's one of the gentlest, most human things Dexter ever does. In a season that's mostly about a friendship turning sour, that one small act of tenderness toward a dying woman is the thing I remember most. It's a reminder that underneath all the plastic and the ritual there was sometimes something that looked a lot like kindness. And then there's the wedding, because the back half of the season is Dexter and Rita planning to get married. And there's a real warmth to watching this man who barely understands his own emotions fumble his way through seating charts and vows and the absurd machinery of a wedding. He asks Miguel to be his best man, which is part of why the betrayal stings, and there's a comedy to Dexter, the meticulous killer being completely defeated by the logistics of a reception. The show was always at its best when it let Dexter be a little ordinary, a little overwhelmed by the same domestic nonsense the rest of us deal with. And Season 3 has a fair bit of that. One thing I always come back to with Season 3 is where it sits in Dexter's emotional development, because in hindsight, it's a more important season than its ranking suggests. This is the season where Dexter, almost despite himself, starts genuinely wanting the things ordinary people want. A friend he doesn't have to lie to, a wife, a child on the way, a best man at his wedding. Through the first 2 seasons, Dexter mostly maintained relationships as cover, as camouflage, as parts of the performance. Season 3 is where the performance starts to become the actual life, where he catches himself caring about outcomes a hollow man shouldn't care about. The Miguel friendship is the clearest version of that hunger, but it's everywhere in this season, this dawning, slightly bewildered realization that he might want to belong somewhere. And that makes the betrayal sting more, because Dexter didn't just lose a partner in crime, he'd lost the first friend he ever let himself believe in. So while the plot mechanics are uneven, the emotional groundwork being laid here is essential. Everything that makes Season 4 devastating depends on Dexter having first learned in Season 3 that he had something to lose. And here's a fun detail I always enjoy. There's a recurring bit where Dexter, trying to figure out how to be a normal husband and friend, essentially studies human behavior like an anthropologist taking field notes. He watches Miguel for cues on how friends are supposed to act. He copies, he mirrors, he calibrates. And it's quietly funny because it's the same meticulous observational skill he uses to plan a kill, just redirected at the baffling business of a backyard barbecue. The show never makes a big joke of it, but it's there if you're watching for it, this man applying serial killer level attention to the question of how tightly one is supposed to hug an acquaintance. Pretty wild when you sit with it. The finale, too, is a bit of a soft landing compared to what the show is capable of. It resolves the Miguel arc satisfyingly enough, but it doesn't have the gut punch, the thing that knocks the wind out of you, that the very best Dexter seasons end on. It closes the book neatly rather than slamming it shut. And in a show this good, neat isn't quite enough to climb any higher than this. One thing I'll add in Season 3's favor before we move on, because it doesn't get said enough, is that it's a remarkably warm season for a show this dark. The Miguel friendship, for all that it sours, gives Dexter more genuine companionship and laughter than he gets in almost any other year. There are barbecues and golf and late-night drinks, and the easy banter of 2 men who actually enjoy each other's company. And there's the wedding and the baby on the way, in a sense, however temporary, of a life filling up with people. Even knowing how it ends, those middle stretches have a glow to them, a glimpse of the ordinary happiness Dexter keeps reaching for. It's the calm before things curdle, and the show lets it breathe. In a series so often defined by isolation and dread, a season with this much warmth in its bones is worth appreciating, even if the warmth is ultimately a setup for heartbreak. So number 6 is Season 3, a genuinely good season carried by a genuinely great performance from Jimmy Smits, exploring one of the more tender ideas the show ever reached for, which is loneliness and the longing for a real friend. It just surrounds that idea with a bit more filler and a bit less impact than the seasons above it. The weakest of the good ones, which, when you think about it, is a lovely sort of problem for a show to have. Now let's talk about Season 5, which lands right in the middle of the list, and which I have a real soft spot for, even if it's not one most people would put near the top. This is the transitional season, the one Chip Johannesson steered after Clyde Phillips left. And it had an almost impossible job because it follows directly on from the single most devastating thing the show ever did, which we'll get to properly when we reach the top of the list. For now, all you need to know is that Season 5 opens with Dexter in pieces. The life he'd been building, the marriage, the attempt at something like normal happiness has been ripped away in the most brutal possible fashion, and he's left holding the wreckage and a baby son who's seen something no child should ever see. So the season begins in grief, and I think it handles that grief well. There's a quietness to early Season 5, a sense of a man moving through the world while completely numb. That feels true. Dexter doesn't know who he is without the project of pretending to be normal, and now that the pretense has collapsed, he's adrift. It's a more internal, more wounded version of the character than we usually get. And there's a detail in those opening episodes I've always thought was a clever bit of writing. Dexter, in his grief, is sloppy. He goes after a man named Boyd Fowler, a thoroughly deserving target, and the kill is messier and more emotional than Dexter's kills usually are because he's not thinking clearly, he's drowning. And it's during that kill and the aftermath of it that he discovers Lumen, hidden and terrified, having witnessed the whole thing. So the partnership that defines the season is born directly out of Dexter being at his lowest and least careful. The grief leads him to her. I like that. It ties the emotional state of the season to its actual plot in a way that doesn't feel forced. There's also a thread running through the season where Quinn, the detective, starts to get suspicious of Dexter and hires that corrupt investigator, Liddy, to dig into him. And I mentioned Liddy already as a reason the season ranks where it does, but I'll add that the Quinn and Dexter tension is one of those slow burn things the show liked to plant. A colleague who half senses something is off but can't articulate it. It never reaches the heights of the great suspicious colleague stories, but it keeps a low hum of danger going underneath the main relationship, which the season needs, because the Lumen story is so internal and tender that without some external threat, it might have drifted. I should say a bit more about the villains of this season, the men Lumen and Dexter are hunting, because they're a slightly different kind of antagonist than the show usually built a season around, and it matters to how Season 5 feels. There's no single charismatic mastermind here, no Trinity, no ice truck killer playing an elaborate game. Instead, there's a group, a ring of ordinary-looking, successful men, a motivational speaker among them who've been abducting and brutalizing women together for years and covering for one another. And that diffuseness is deliberate. The horror of this season isn't one extraordinary monster. It's the banality of a group of comfortable men who decided collectively that other people's suffering was theirs to take and who built a little fraternity of cruelty around it. It makes the season's violence feel less like a duel and more like a cleanup, a methodical dismantling of a rotten network one man at a time. And there's a grim satisfaction in watching Lumen reclaim her power by helping take them apart. It's not the flashiest antagonist structure the show ever used, but it suits the season's wounded, grounded mood. And there's the matter of the children, because by Season 5, Dexter is a single father, not just to baby Harrison, but in a complicated way to Rita's two older kids, Aster and Cody. And there's a painful, honest thread in this season about whether Dexter can possibly be what those children need, whether a man like him has any business raising anyone, and ultimately about him making the hard, selfless choice to let them go and live with their grandparents, where they'll be safer and more loved than he can manage. It's not a flashy storyline, but it's a quietly devastating one, a man recognizing his own limits as a parent, and it adds a real ache to the season's edges. And then the season finds its actual story, which is Lumen. Lumen Pierce, played by Julia Stiles, is a woman Dexter discovers has survived something horrific. She's one of several victims of a ring of men who kidnap, abuse, and murder women, and she's the one who got away. And rather than being a target or a threat, Lumen becomes something the show had never really tried before. A partner, someone who learns what Dexter is and chooses with open eyes to stand alongside him. Because she has her own darkness now and her own people who deserve to answer for what they did to her. What I love about the Lumen arc is how gentle it is underneath all the violence. This is, at its heart, two badly damaged people slowly helping each other heal. And the fact that the healing happens to involve hunting down a gang of predators is almost beside the point. Julia Stiles got an award nomination for this, and it's well-deserved because she has to play someone rebuilding herself from almost nothing, and she does it with a fragility that never tips into weakness. The relationship between her and Dexter is one of the few in the whole series that feels like it's genuinely about equals. She is someone he's protecting and sometimes deceiving. She knows exactly what he is, and she's there anyway. There's a lovely idea threaded through all of this too, which is the notion that the darkness inside a person might not be permanent. Late in the season, once Lumen has done what she needed to do, the rage that drove her simply fades. Her own version of what Dexter calls the dark passenger quietly lifts and leaves her, and she's able to walk away and go back to a normal life. And that wrecks Dexter a little because it suggests that his own darkness might be a choice or a wound rather than an unchangeable fact, a thing that could in theory heal if the conditions were right. For one of the only times in the series, the show flirts with the idea that this man could be at peace. And then it lets that possibility walk out the door with Lumen, which is honestly one of the more quietly moving things Season 5 does. To be fair, there are reasons it sits at number 5 rather than higher. There's a corrupt private investigator named Stan Liddy who works out Dexter's secret and threatens to expose him. And while that plot creates some tension, it never quite becomes the major engine the season needs. The overall stakes feel a touch smaller and more contained than the seasons above it. It's an intimate season in a show that, at its best, swings enormous. And there's a slightly shaggy quality to how it gets where it's going. A sense that it found its footing partway through rather than starting on sure ground. There's one more thing about Season 5 I find quietly remarkable, and it's how honest Dexter is forced to be in it, by his standards. For most of the series, Dexter is the only person who knows the full truth of himself, and that isolation is part of his tragedy. But with Lumen, because she saw him kill, because there's no point pretending, he gets to drop the performance entirely. He doesn't have to manage her perception of him or feed her a cover story. She knows. And watching a man who has spent his whole life behind glass suddenly get to be seen, fully without consequence, is genuinely affecting. The season understands that the loneliest thing about Dexter isn't the killing, it's the lying, the endless, exhausting work of being unknowable. For a few episodes with Lumen, he gets to set that work down. And the fact that it can't last, that she heals and leaves and he goes back behind the glass, is the real heartbreak of the season. Quieter and smaller than Rita's death, but cut from the same cloth. But none of that bothers me much because what Season 5 does well, it does beautifully. It's the season about putting yourself back together after the worst thing imaginable. It gives us one of the show's warmest and most equal relationships. And it ends not on a shocking betrayal or a body count, but on something quieter and rarer for this show, which is a kind of bruised, tentative hope. Dexter doesn't end the season fixed, but he ends it a little less alone than he started, and a little more aware that being alone might not be his only option. For a show this dark, that's almost radical. And it's why Season 5, the quiet middle child of the whole run, sits comfortably right here at number 5. It's the season I'd recommend to someone who thinks Dexter is only about shocks and kills, because it understands that the most interesting thing about this character was never the violence. It was the wanting to be normal, to be loved, to be less alone. Season 5 is the show remembering that, in the middle of its grief, and it's all the better for it. And that brings us to season 7, which is where this list crosses over from the good seasons into the genuinely great ones, and where, for me at least, the show briefly found a second wind that almost nobody expected it to find. Remember where we left things back in season 6, with Deborah standing in that church doorway watching her brother finish a kill? Season 7 picks up in that exact moment, and the entire season is about the fallout. And this is the thing I want to stress, because it's what makes the season special. For 6 years, the great unanswered question of the show had been, what happens when someone Dexter truly loves finds out what he is? Not a colleague, not an enemy, someone whose whole world is built around him. Season 7 is finally the answer, and it does not flinch from how messy that answer would be. Deborah's reaction unfolds in stages, and Jennifer Carpenter plays every one of them perfectly. First, there's denial and horror. Then there's a desperate attempt to control it, to manage her brother, to keep him on some kind of leash and pretend it can all be contained. Then there's the slow, awful realization that she can't fix him, and she can't turn him in, and she can't stop loving him either, and that she is now bound to him in a way that's quietly destroying her. The relationship between these two becomes the beating heart of the season, this terrible, intimate, codependent thing where the closest bond in the show curdles into something neither of them knows how to carry. It's genuinely uncomfortable to watch in the best way. Around that core, the season gives Dexter 2 strong external stories, and I think it's worth talking about both because they're better than they often get credit for. The first is the Ukrainian mob, the Koshka Brotherhood, and specifically a man named Isaac Sirko, played by Ray Stevenson. Isaac comes to Miami hunting Dexter for killing one of his men, and what could have been a generic gangster villain becomes something much more interesting, because Isaac is intelligent, principled in his own strange way, and grieving. The cat and mouse between him and Dexter gradually turns into something closer to mutual respect, 2 predators who recognize each other. Stevenson is wonderful in the part, and Isaac is, I'd argue, one of the more underrated antagonists in the whole series. He deserves more attention than he tends to get. The thing that lifts Isaac above the usual run of Dexter villains is the reveal of why he's really hunting Dexter, and I'll touch on it gently because it's handled with real delicacy. The man Dexter killed, the one Isaac has crossed an ocean to avenge, wasn't just a soldier in Isaac's organization. He was the person Isaac loved. And once you understand that, every cold, methodical move Isaac makes is recolored as grief. The grief of a powerful man who can't show what he's lost to anyone around him because of the world he lives in. There's a scene late on where Isaac and Dexter end up simply talking, 2 killers sharing a drink, and Isaac speaks about loss in a way that lands on Dexter precisely because Dexter is himself a man acquainted with losing the people he loves. They are enemies who understand each other completely, and the season is wise enough to let that understanding soften into something almost like friendship before the end. It's a lovely, melancholy thread, and Stevenson plays it with this weary dignity that stays with you. Here's a small detail I appreciate too. Isaac is one of the few adversaries who genuinely outclasses Dexter in a straight fight, who's smarter and more dangerous and better resourced, and the season doesn't pretend otherwise. Dexter survives him not by being superior, but by circumstance, and by the strange truce the 2 of them eventually reach. It's a refreshing change from the seasons where Dexter glides over every obstacle. For once, he's up against someone who could simply have him killed and knows it and chooses something more complicated instead. The second story is Hannah Mukai. Hannah is a poisoner, a killer in her own right, and she and Dexter fall for each other. And unlike so many of Dexter's relationships, this one isn't built on a lie because there's no lie left to tell. She is what he is. For the first time, he's with someone who shares his nature completely. Not a survivor like Lumen, who picked up darkness through trauma, but someone who simply is what she is the way he simply is what he is. It's a genuine mirror, and the relationship is charged and dangerous and oddly tender all at once. There's a lovely complication to Hannah that the season handles well, which is that you're never entirely sure whether to trust her, and neither is Dexter, and neither, crucially, is Deborah. Hannah has a history, a body count of her own, much of it tangled up with an abusive older man she ran with as a teenager. And the question of whether she's genuinely fallen for Dexter or whether she's simply the kind of person who'll do whatever keeps her safe hangs over every scene she's in. Yvonne Strahovski plays her with this watchful, unhurried calm that makes you lean in. She's never panicked, never desperate, always 3 moves ahead, and that poise is exactly what makes her both attractive and frightening. The chemistry between her and Michael C. Hall is real, which matters because the whole back half of the season hinges on you believing Dexter would risk everything for this woman. And it puts Deborah in an unbearable position, which the show is smart enough to lean into. Deborah doesn't just disapprove of Hannah on principle as a cop who knows what Hannah is. There's a jealousy threaded underneath it too, a complicated, never quite spoken thing about Deborah's own feelings for her brother that the season had the nerve to gesture at. It's uncomfortable territory, and the show doesn't dwell on it luridly, but it's there, adding another layer to why Deborah cannot stand the sight of Hannah. Her brother has finally found someone who makes him happy, and that someone is a murderer, and Deborah is left watching the 2 halves of her own impossible situation, her love for Dexter and her duty as a cop, get even more hopelessly knotted. What I find genuinely brave about the Hannah relationship is that the season refuses to make her safe. A more timid show would have softened Hannah, reassured us that underneath it all she's harmless, that Dexter's instinct to trust her is sound. This season won't do that. It keeps Hannah genuinely dangerous right to the end. Keeps you and Dexter both unsure whether loving her is the best thing that's happened to him or a fatal misjudgment. There's a stretch where the relationship turns genuinely lethal, where trust and betrayal blur together, and the show lets you sit in that uncertainty without resolving it cleanly. It's a relationship built on the knowledge that either of these people could, in the right circumstances, kill the other, and that they love each other anyway, partly because of that rather than in spite of it. That's a strange, adult, slightly frightening kind of romance, and the show commits to it fully. It would have been so easy to blink, and the season doesn't. Now, there's a lot of plot in this season, and not all of it is equally graceful. The Hannah storyline and the Isaac storyline and the Deborah storyline are all fighting for room, and occasionally you can feel the season straining to service all of them. But it mostly holds because every single one of those threads is feeding the same central question, which is whether Dexter can ever really be known by another person and survive it. And then there's the ending, which is the thing that locks season 7 into the top 4. LaGuerre 2, who has never stopped quietly believing that the Bay Harbor butcher case from years ago was never truly solved, gets closer and closer to the truth, and closer specifically to Dexter. I want to give LaGuerre her due here because she spends the season being the one competent investigator in the building, quietly pulling threads everyone else had let go slack. She becomes convinced the wrong man was blamed all those years ago, and she's right. And she follows that conviction with a patience and a thoroughness that frankly the department rarely showed otherwise. There's a real tragedy in it because her competence is precisely what dooms her. The better a job she does, the closer she gets to a truth that the people she trusts cannot allow her to reach. By the finale, she has enough to arrest him, but not enough to actually bring him down. And so we arrive at an impossible scene, where Deborah is forced to choose between her brother and her boss, between the man she loves and the law she's given her entire life to. And she chooses Dexter. She shoots LaGuerre too. She murders an innocent good colleague to protect a killer because that killer is her brother. And in doing so, she crosses a line she can never uncross and damns herself completely. It's a devastating, irreversible choice, and the season ends on Deborah's face as the full weight of what she's done settles onto her. Here's a small irony I always find striking about this season. by the measures the industry cares about, by sheer number of people watching across every platform, this was the most popular the show ever got. Season 8 pulled the biggest total audience of the entire run. The show was at its absolute peak of reach right at the moment it was, creatively, about to fall off the edge. People were more invested than ever just before the disappointment of the finale year would test that investment to breaking point. There's something almost poignant in that, the biggest crowd gathered right before the fall. What I find most striking about Season 7, looking back, is how much of it is about lines that can't be uncrossed. The whole season is a series of doors closing behind people. Debra crosses a line by covering for her brother instead of arresting him, and then crosses a far worse one by killing for him. Dexter, for his part, spends the season getting more comfortable being known, first by Deborah, then by Hannah, slowly letting down a guard he's held up his entire life. And there's a real question buried in there about whether being known is making him safer or more reckless. The more people who carry his secret, the more the careful architecture of his life starts to feel less like a fortress and more like a house of cards. By the end, the secret isn't really a secret anymore, not in the way it used to be. And the season understands that this is both a relief and a catastrophe. Dexter has always wanted to be seen. Season 7 grants the wish and then shows him the price, which is that everyone who truly sees him ends up damaged by the seeing. That's a heavy, melancholy idea, and the season earns it. So number 4 is Season 7. A season that took the show's oldest question, finally answered it, and built around that answer 2 excellent villains and the most morally catastrophic ending in the series up to that point. It's a little overstuffed, and it's the last truly great season the show would produce. But great it absolutely is, and it earns its place comfortably in the top half. Now we're into the top 3, and the air gets thin up here, because these are the seasons I'd happily defend to anyone. Number 3 is Season 2, and I want to spend a proper amount of time on it because of all 8 seasons, this is the one that generated the most pure, sustained, nail-biting tension. And tension is the thing the show was never quite able to manufacture this well ever again. Let me back up and explain why, because to understand what makes Season 2 special, you have to understand the bind it puts Dexter in. For the whole of Season 1, the threat came from outside. Someone was hunting Dexter, taunting him, but the danger was external. Season 2 flips that completely. The danger in Season 2 is Dexter's own past, literally surfacing. Divers off the coast of Miami discover a collection of weighted bags on the sea floor, and inside those bags are the dismembered remains of Dexter's victims, years of them, his entire underwater graveyard hauled up into the light. And just like that, the most meticulous secret keeper on television has the evidence of his life's work sitting in an evidence locker at the very police station where he works. Think about that for a second. The thing every other season has to invent, a reason for Dexter to be afraid, Season 2 just hands you for free because his own body count is now a public case. They call the unknown killer the Bay Harbor Butcher. The FBI comes to town, and the man leading the investigation is one of the best characters the show ever produced, a quiet, brilliant, almost gentle agent named Frank Lundy. Lundy isn't loud or aggressive. He's patient and methodical and genuinely good at his job, which makes him more frightening than any shouting could, because for the first time, someone competent is actually looking and looking in the right direction. And then, layered on top of all of that, you have Dokes. Now, Dokes had been a thorn in Dexter's side from the very beginning, and I think he deserves a proper word here because he's central to why this season works. From the first episode of the series, Sergeant James Dokes was the only person at Miami Metro who looked at Dexter and felt something was wrong. Everyone else accepted the performance, the smile, the donuts, the harmless lab rat persona. Dokes never did. He'd stare a beat too long. He'd ask where Dexter had been. And there's a reason, which the show is smart about. Dokes is a former Special Forces soldier. He's killed people. He knows in his body what it looks like when someone has taken a life and felt the wrong thing about it. He doesn't know the specifics, he couldn't tell you about the kill rooms or the plastic or the blood slides, but he recognizes the shape of the thing. He clocks the predator behind the friendly mask because he spent time around predators and around himself. In season 2, that long simmering suspicion finally boils over because Dokes starts following Dexter, properly following him. And this is where the season becomes almost unbearable in the best way, because now Dexter has 2 hunters closing in at once. Lundy working the case officially with the full weight of the FBI, and Dokes working it privately, obsessively, certain he's right and unable to prove it. Dexter spends the season being squeezed from both sides, and there's nowhere for him to hide because the evidence is his own, and the man on his tail knows exactly what he's looking at. The Dokes situation eventually escalates into one of the most genuinely tense stretches of the entire series, with Dexter holding Dokes captive and wrestling for once with a target the code can't easily account for. Dokes isn't a killer who deserves the table. He's a good cop who got too close, and what to do about him becomes a real moral knot, one the show actually lets be a knot rather than untangling it cheaply. The resolution, when it comes, isn't even of Dexter's making, and that's part of why it works. Dokes dies in an explosion at the cabin where he's being held, and he ends up framed posthumously as the Bay Harbor Butcher himself. The hunter becomes a scapegoat. Dexter walks free, not because he was clever enough to escape, but because the pieces happened to fall a certain way. There's something deeply uneasy about that, an innocent man's name destroyed to protect the guilty one, and the show knows it's uneasy and lets you sit in it. There's a warmer thread running alongside all this dread too, and it belongs to Deborah. In season 2, Deborah, still raw from the catastrophe of season 1, falls into a relationship with Lundy, the very FBI agent hunting her brother without anyone realizing it. And it's genuinely sweet. Lundy is older, gentle, steady, completely unlike the chaos Deborah usually finds herself drawn to. And you can see her soften around him, see her start to believe she might deserve something calm and good. The dramatic irony is almost cruel because the kind, decent man making Deborah happy is the same man whose job, if he succeeds, is to put her brother on death row. The show rarely got to give Deborah happiness, and watching it here, knowing the ground it's built on, is one of the quieter pleasures of the season. I also want to give a nod to what the fake addiction storyline accidentally does for the character, setting aside how plausible it is. Dexter, to keep his cover, starts attending Narcotics Anonymous meetings, and he sits in those rooms listening to people talk about a compulsion that controls them, an appetite they can't reason away, a thing they have to manage one day at a time for the rest of their lives. And it lands on him, because that is, of course, exactly his own situation, just with a different object. The show lets Dexter quietly recognize himself in the language of addiction and recovery. And it's one of the more thoughtful pieces of self-reflection the character ever gets. He's pretending to be an addict, and in the pretending, he stumbles onto something true about what he actually is. And there's a detail about the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation that I've always loved, which is the public reaction. As the case becomes a sensation, parts of the Miami public start to treat the unknown butcher as a kind of folk hero. Someone who only kills bad people, who's doing what the courts won't. There are people cheering him on, and Dexter has to walk through a city that's half hunting him and half celebrating him, listening to strangers debate whether the man whose crimes could end his life might actually be a force for good. It's the show holding a mirror up to its own audience, gently, because of course we're cheering him on too. We've been doing it for 2 seasons. It's a clever, self-aware little touch in a season full of them. There's something almost unbearably sad about the Dokes situation when you sit with it, because Dokes is, by every ordinary measure, the hero of this story. He's a real cop who correctly identified a real monster through nothing but instinct and persistence when everyone around him was fooled. In a different show, Dokes is the protagonist, the dogged detective who finally nails the killer everyone trusted. And the cruelty of Dexter, the show, is that it puts us so firmly inside Dexter, the character, that we end up dreading the very thing we should be cheering for. We don't want Dokes to win, even though winning would mean justice, because winning would mean the end of the man we've come to care about. The season forces you to notice that your own sympathies have been quietly bent into a shape you might not be comfortable with, and it never lets you off the hook for it. That's a genuinely sophisticated thing for a thriller to do, and it's part of why the season holds up to rewatching so well. Now, I have to talk about Lila, because she's the one part of the season people argue about, and fairly. Lila is Dexter's Narcotics Anonymous sponsor, and she draws him into a chaotic affair, which is itself the cover that ties the whole subplot together. The fake addiction is itself a slightly generous bit of writing, since Rita had lived with a real addict and her violent ex-husband, and you'd think she'd know the signs, but let's set that aside. Lila is meant to be a chaotic, dangerous figure who pulls Dexter toward embracing his true self rather than suppressing it, and Jaime Murray plays her with real commitment. The trouble is that Lila tips, by the end, into a kind of cartoonish obsession that sits oddly against the grounded dread of the Lundy and Dokes material. She becomes a melodrama villain in a season that's otherwise a taut thriller. And yet, even with Lila as the wobble, this season is extraordinary. Critically, it remains the highest regarded season the show ever made. I don't think that's a fluke. It's the season where Dexter has the most to lose and the least control, where the threat is woven from his own history and where two very different hunters circle him at the same time. It's the closest the show ever came to being a genuine edge-of-your-seat thriller from start to finish. There's a weight that the Dokes resolution leaves on the show too that I think is worth naming because it's part of why this season feels so substantial. Dexter doesn't walk away from what happened to Dokes clean, not emotionally. He knows on some level that a good man died and was disgraced so that he could go on living. The code is supposed to keep Dexter from harming the innocent, and here the innocent was harmed anyway, indirectly, through Dexter's own actions and inactions, and the rules had nothing useful to say about it. It's one of the first real cracks in the idea that Harry's system can keep Dexter's life morally tidy. The blood doesn't stay neatly on the deserving, it's spread, and the show lets Dexter carry a quiet guilt about Dokes that lingers past the season, which is exactly the sort of consequence a lesser show would have tidied away. It makes the victory of season 2 a hollow one, and the hollowness is the point. So why only third, you might reasonably ask if it's the most tense and the best reviewed. And the honest answer is that the 2 seasons above it reach for something even harder than tension. They reach for the heart. Season 2 will keep you gripped. The 2 still to come will break it a little. And as much as I admire the white-knuckle craft of season 2, I think the seasons that wound you stay with you longer. But make no mistake, this is a near-perfect season, and on a different night, in a different mood, I could easily see myself bumping it higher. Since we're talking about seasons that get everything right, let's move to number 2, which is the one that started it all. Season 1, the pilot, the introduction. The season that had the hardest job of any of them, which was to make you care about a serial killer, and pulled it off so completely that the show ran for years on the goodwill it built in those first 12 episodes. I think the thing season 1 understood better than any season that came after it is restraint. Watch the opening episode again sometime and notice how little it explains. It shows you Dexter moving through Miami, doing his job, performing normality, and through his internal monologue, it lets you into the strange, dry, lonely interior of a man who experiences the world differently from everyone around him. You're not lectured about what he is. You're slipped inside his head and allowed to work it out, to feel the gap between the warm face he shows the world and the cold machinery running underneath. That voiceover, which the show sometimes leaned on too heavily in later years, is at its absolute sharpest here. Funny, unsettling, weirdly relatable in small flashes, and always just a little bit wrong in a way that keeps you off balance. It's worth dwelling on the pilot specifically because pilots are genuinely hard, and most shows take a season or two to figure out what they are. And Dexter arrived almost fully formed. The very first episode knows exactly what it is. It opens with Dexter prowling Miami at night, and within minutes it has shown you a kill, established the code, introduced the central cast, and crucially made you complicit. By the time Dexter has dispatched his first on-screen target, a man who genuinely deserved it, the show has already performed its central magic trick. It's got you nodding along. It's got you thinking, well, that man had it coming. And once you've thought that, you're on Dexter's side, and the show has you for the next 8 years. There's a confidence to that first hour that's rare. It doesn't apologize for its premise or ease you in slowly. It just trusts that the writing and the performance are strong enough to carry you past the moral queasiness. And they are. I'd put it up there with the great television pilots, the ones that arrive knowing precisely what story they're telling and how. The plot is built around a killer the press dubbed the ice truck killer, who leaves behind crime scenes that are, in a horrible way, beautiful, bloodless, precise, bodies drained and dismembered with a care that Dexter, of all people, can't help but admire. And that's the clever hook of it, because this killer isn't taunting Dexter at random. He's speaking to him. He seems to know things. He leaves messages that feel tailored, personal, like a conversation only Dexter is equipped to understand. The ice truck killer is, in effect, courting him, reaching out to the one person in Miami who might appreciate the artistry. And the reveal, when it comes, is the best the show ever did, because it isn't just a clever twist, it's an emotional one. The ice truck killer is Baryun Moiser, Dexter's biological brother. A brother he didn't know he had, who was present alongside a very young Dexter during the traumatic event that shaped them both. Their mother's brutal murder, witnessed by 2 tiny boys left sitting in her blood. 2 brothers came out of that room. One was adopted by a police officer named Harry, who recognized the darkness in the boy and tried to channel it into something with rules, something pointed at people who deserved it. The other was not, and grew up without a Harry, without a code, without anyone to aim him anywhere. And so you get these 2 men formed by the exact same horror, who became 2 very different kinds of killer purely because of what happened to them afterward. It's a genuinely brilliant piece of design because it makes Brian a dark mirror. He's what Dexter might have been. He's the version with no leash. And that's what turns the finale into something more than a thriller climax. Brian doesn't really want to fight Dexter. He wants to free him. He wants Dexter to drop the pretense, abandon the fake life, and embrace what they both are as brothers together. And to prove his commitment, he asks Dexter to kill the one person standing between Dexter and that unburdened life, which is Deborah, his adoptive sister, the person who represents every human attachment Dexter has spent his life maintaining. So the choice the season ends on is achingly clean, blood or family, the brother who shares his nature or the sister who shares his life. And Dexter chooses Deborah. He chooses the messy, demanding, fully human bond over the seductive freedom of being understood completely. He kills Brian, and he stages it to look like a suicide, and he grieves him even as he does it, because some part of Dexter genuinely wanted what Brian was offering and had to kill it to keep the life he'd built. There's a detail in how Dexter kills Brian that I think is easy to rush past but says everything. He doesn't just kill his brother, he kills him gently and he stages it as a suicide. And he sheds a tear while he does it, which for Dexter is roughly the equivalent of another person collapsing in grief. This is a man who insists constantly that he feels nothing, that the emotions are all performance. And here, in the act of destroying the one person who truly understood him, the performance cracks just for a moment and something real leaks through. He mourns Brian. He mourns the version of his own life where he could have said yes to the offer. The show is telling you, right at the end of its first season, that Dexter's emptiness is not as total as he believes it is, that there's something in there capable of love and loss, however buried. Everything the series does afterward is, in one way or another, about that buried something trying to get out. That choice is the entire show in miniature. The series spent 7 more seasons exploring that tension, and it never stated it more cleanly than it did the very first time. Before I move off season 1, there are a few threads worth lingering on because the season does a quiet amount of work setting up people we'll spend years with. Take Rita. When we meet her, Dexter has chosen her precisely because she's damaged. She's the survivor of an abusive, addicted ex-husband. And she's so wary of men, so uninterested in physical intimacy after what she's been through, that Dexter finds her safe. He doesn't really feel desire the way other people do, so a partner who doesn't expect much of that from him is, in his cold calculation, ideal. He's dating her as camouflage, and the lovely, sad irony the season sets in motion is that this arrangement of pure convenience slowly, against his own intentions, starts turning into something real. He doesn't plan to care about Rita and her kids. It just happens to him, almost without his permission. And watching that begin is one of the gentler pleasures of the early show. I also want to say a word about the flashbacks because they're a structural device the show leans on for its entire run. And season 1 is where they're introduced most gracefully. Throughout the season, we keep cutting back to Dexter's childhood and adolescence, to Harry teaching him, training him, shaping him. And these aren't just exposition. They're the emotional argument of the show, laid out a piece at a time. We see a worried father trying to do an impossible thing, to love a child he doesn't fully understand, and to keep that child from becoming a horror. Harry appears throughout the present-day story as well as a figure Dexter imagines and talks to, a kind of internal conscience in the shape of his dead dad. And it works beautifully here. Before later seasons occasionally overused it because it gives Dexter someone to argue with, a way to externalize the rules rattling around in his head. And there's Deborah, who begins the series as someone almost nobody at Miami Metro takes seriously. She's a vice cop, desperate to make homicide, overlooked, a little too eager, swearing her way through every scene to cover how much she wants to be respected. Over the course of season 1, she gets pulled deep into the ice truck killer case, and her investigation becomes personal in a way she can't yet understand. Because in one of the season's crueler turns, the man she falls for during the case turns out to be the killer himself. Brian, posing as a mild-mannered prosthetics expert named Rudy, courts Deborah specifically to get close to Dexter. So Deborah ends the season having been used as a pawn in a game between 2 brothers she didn't know were brothers, nearly murdered by a man she'd let herself love. It's a brutal initiation, and it's the foundation of everything that makes her such a wreck and such a compelling one in the years that follow. And really, the most important thing season 1 quietly establishes isn't any of the plot machinery, it's the bond between Dexter and Deborah. By the end of these 12 episodes, the show has made absolutely clear that whatever else Dexter is or isn't capable of feeling, he loves his sister. It's the one relationship that isn't camouflage, isn't strategy, isn't a performance he can switch off. When the finale forces him to choose between Brian and Deborah, between the brother who offers him freedom and the sister who anchors him to the human world, the fact that he chooses Deborah tells you everything about where the show's heart is. Everything that happens across all 8 seasons, every choice that matters, ultimately roots back through that bond. It's the thread the whole series is strung on, and season 1 is where it's tied off. So when people ask what makes the early show work so well, I always come back to this, that underneath the high concept premise, it had the good sense to be, at its core, a story about a brother and a sister, and to take that love seriously. The killing is the hook. The siblings are the soul. I should mention this was also the season most closely drawn from the original novel by Jeff Lindsay, the book that started the whole thing. After this, the show went almost entirely its own way, inventing original stories that had nothing to do with the later novels. But season 1 still has that source material underneath it, giving it a tightness and a shape that a writer's room building from scratch sometimes lacks. You can feel the bones of a complete, self-contained story in it. So why is the season that did everything right only at number 2? It's a fair question, and the answer is almost unfair to season 1. It's at number 2 because the season above it took this same emotional machinery, the family, the attachment, the terrible cost of letting people in, and pushed it even further to a place that genuinely hurts. Season 1 is a flawless beginning. It's elegant, it's controlled, it's the cleanest single piece of storytelling the show ever produced. But it's a beginning, and beginnings, for all their craft, are about promise. There's one season that took everything season 1 promised and cashed it in for the most devastating hour the show ever made. And that's where we're going next. And so we arrive at the top of the list, which, if you spent any time around Dexter fans, you probably saw coming from a long way off. Number 1 is season 4, the Trinity season, the one with John Lithgow. The season the entire rest of the show, before and after, ends up being measured against. Let me set up what makes the premise so strong, because it's a little different from the other great seasons, and that difference is the whole point. By season 4, Dexter's life has changed enormously. He's married to Rita now. He's a father with a new baby son, Harrison, plus Rita's 2 older children. He's genuinely trying, to be a husband and a dad and a normal suburban man while also maintaining his secret life, and he's exhausted by it. He's not sleeping. He's making mistakes. The 2 halves of his existence are pulling him apart at the seams. And into that struggle walks the season's villain. And the villain is precisely, devastatingly, the answer to Dexter's exact problem. Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity killer, is a serial murderer who has been active for decades, longer than almost any killer the show ever featured, and who has never been caught. And the reason he's never been caught is that, on the surface, he is the perfect family man. He has a wife. He has children. He's a pillar of his church and his community. He volunteers building houses for the needy. He appears to everyone around him to be a kind, devoted, gentle patriarch. And he has somehow held this elaborate double life together for 30-odd years without anyone suspecting a thing. Now, do you see why Dexter is drawn to him? Dexter is failing at the exact thing Arthur appears to have mastered. Dexter can barely keep his secret life and his family life from colliding. And here is a man who's been doing both, seemingly flawlessly, for as long as anyone can remember. So Dexter doesn't kill Arthur when he gets the chance. Instead, he does something far more dangerous. He inserts himself into Arthur's life, befriends him, studies him, because he wants to learn the secret. He wants to know how Arthur does it. He looks at this monster and sees, of all things, a mentor, a model for how to have it all. And this is the great, agonizing irony the season is built on, the one I think makes it the best the show ever did. Because Arthur's perfect family life is a lie, and not the kind of lie Dexter imagines. Behind closed doors, Arthur's a tyrant. His family doesn't love him, they're terrified of him. His home is a place of fear and control and quiet misery. The thing Dexter is trying to learn from him doesn't exist. Arthur hasn't solved the problem of being both a killer and a family man. He's just brutalized his family into performing happiness at gunpoint, metaphorically and at times not so metaphorically. Dexter is taking lessons from a man whose whole life is a hollow, rotten counterfeit of the very thing Dexter actually has and is too distracted to value. Let me dwell for a bit on the texture of Dexter's life this season, because it's part of what makes the whole thing so good. The exhaustion is real and specific. There's a brand new baby in the house, and anyone who's been near a newborn knows what that does to a person, and the show plays it almost as comedy at first. Dexter, the most controlled man alive, is undone by sleep deprivation. He starts making small mistakes. He nods off at the wheel. He forgets things. He's stretched between a wife, 3 children, a demanding job, and a secret life that requires absolute precision. And he simply does not have the hours in the day. There's a wonderful, awful relatability to it. Strip away the murder, and it's just a knackered new dad trying to hold too many things together, and the show knows that's funny and sad at the same time. Into that fog comes a returning face, because Frank Lundy, the gentle FBI agent from the second season, comes back to Miami. He's retired now, but he's been privately chasing one last case for years, and that case is Trinity. Lundy has worked out that there's a single killer behind a pattern of deaths stretching back decades, a killer nobody else even believes exists. So you have the show's best investigator back on the board, circling the same target as Dexter, and for a moment, it feels like the season might become another cat and mouse with Lundy. And then, fairly early on, the show takes him off the board entirely. Lundy is shot and killed, gunned down in what looks at the time like a random act, and the one person who might have caught Trinity through honest detective work is gone almost before he's begun. It lands hard, especially for Deborah, who never stopped loving him. His death sits over the whole season like a held breath. It's worth understanding what Trinity actually is too, because the mechanics of him are part of why he's so unsettling. Arthur kills in a fixed, repeating cycle, a sequence of murders he reenacts over and over, decade after decade, each one a recreation of a specific trauma from his own childhood. It's ritual in the truest sense, a man condemned to perform the same horror on an endless loop, never healing, never stopping, just repeating. And he's built an entire respectable life around the gaps between the killings. That combination, the orderly suburban dad and the man trapped in a compulsive cycle of grief and violence, is exactly the mirror the season wants to hold up to Dexter, who is himself a man performing normality around a compulsion he can't shake. And then there's the cover identity, which I have to mention because it's one of the small details that makes the season's ending hurt even more. To get close to Arthur and his family, Dexter invents an alias. He tells the Mitchells his name is Kyle Butler. He becomes, in effect, a fake family friend, inserting himself into their home, their dinners, their lives, all while studying Arthur like a specimen. And the awful thing is that Arthur's terrified family come to see Kyle Butler as something like an ally, a witness to their suffering, maybe even someone who might help. The alias is a lie built on a lie. And when it all comes crashing down, that false name becomes one more thread Dexter can't fully tuck away. He spent the season being a phantom in someone else's home. And phantoms leave marks. John Lithgow is, and I don't think this is an overstatement, astonishing in this role. He plays Arthur as charming and pitiable and monstrous, sometimes within the same scene, sometimes within the same breath. There's a softness to him, a wounded little boy quality, that makes him genuinely frightening because you can never quite predict which Arthur you're going to get. The performance won every award going, and deservedly so. It's one of the great television villain performances, full stop, and it elevates everything around it. What makes the family scenes in particular so hard to watch, in the best way, is how ordinary they look on the surface, and how much dread sits underneath. You'll have a scene at the Mitchell dinner table that, if you muted it, could be any suburban family having supper. And yet every person at that table is calibrating their behavior around the mood of a man who might erupt at any second. The terror is in the small things. A daughter going very still, a son measuring his words, a wife's smile that doesn't reach her eyes. Lithgow conducts all of it. He can turn the temperature of a room with a single look. And because Dexter is in those scenes too, playing his Kyle Butler role, you're watching one predator study another across a dinner table while a terrified family performs normality between them. It's an extraordinary thing to sustain, and the season sustains it for hours. The suspense doesn't come from chases or near misses. It comes from sitting in a pleasant living room knowing exactly what the pleasant man hosting you is capable of. And then there's the ending, which I have to talk about, because it's the reason this season sits at the very top, and it's the most devastating thing the show ever did. For most of the season, the tension is whether Dexter will kill Arthur before Arthur figures out who Dexter really is, and eventually, finally, Dexter does kill him. He gets him on the table, and he ends Trinity, and there's a moment where it feels like a victory. Dexter has won, he's beaten the great undefeated killer, and he can go home to his family. And then he goes home. I'm not going to walk you through it beat by beat, because if you've seen it, you don't need me to. And if you haven't, I'd rather you came to it the way the rest of us did, with no idea what was about to happen. But I'll say this. Dexter arrives home having won and discovers that while he was busy beating Arthur, Arthur had already done the one thing Dexter could never undo. He finds Rita dead, and he finds his infant son, Harrison, sitting on the bathroom floor in a pool of his mother's blood, crying, exactly as Dexter himself once sat in his own mother's blood all those years ago. The trauma that created Dexter has just been passed down by Dexter's own carelessness to his own son. The cycle has closed, and the season ends right there on Dexter holding his bloodied child, having destroyed the very thing he spent the whole season trying to protect, undone not by his enemy's strength, but by his own hesitation and his own arrogance in thinking he could befriend a monster and walk away clean. It is, quite simply, the most powerful ending the show ever produced, and one of the most powerful endings in the medium. It was, when it aired, a ratings high for the show. A record it held for years, and it won awards for its direction. And none of that matters next to the simple fact that it knocks the wind clean out of you. It takes everything the show had been building, the family, the double life, the cost of connection, all of it, and it detonates the lot in a single image. What makes that final image resonate so far beyond a single shocking death is what it says about the whole project of the show. Remember the code. Remember that Harry built it to keep the darkness contained, to make sure the horror that created Dexter never spread any further. The entire premise rested on the hope that this thing could be managed, walled off, prevented from touching anyone innocent. And the season 4 ending is the moment that hope is revealed as a fantasy. Dexter's darkness, his choices, his hubris reach right past all the careful rules and land squarely on his own infant son, planting in that child the exact seed that was planted in Dexter all those years ago. The cycle Harry tried to break is not broken, it's been handed down. And the awful implication is that no code, however careful, can truly contain what Dexter is, because the danger was never only in the killing. It was in the man himself, and in the simple fact that monsters cannot help but make more monsters. It's the bleakest thing the show ever said, and it said it without a word of dialogue, just a crying baby in a pool of blood. That's why season 4 is number 1, and honestly, it isn't especially close. It has the show's best villain in its best performance. It's built on its sharpest, cruelest irony, a man seeking parenting advice from a monster while neglecting the family he already has. And it ends on the moment the entire series, in some sense, was always heading toward. Every season after it lived in its shadow. Some came close. None surpassed it. It's the peak, and it's a peak the show could be proud of for the rest of its life. Now that we've got all 8 laid out, I want to wander a little before we wind down properly through some of the things that stayed constant no matter where a season landed on the list. Because rankings are all about differences, and it's easy to forget how much these 8 seasons share. Think of this as the part of the evening where we stop sorting and just appreciate. The most obvious constant is the man at the center. Michael C. Hall is in nearly every scene of all 8 seasons, carrying the entire impossible premise on his shoulders, and there is genuinely never a season where he gets worse. Even in the years where the writing wobbled, even when the plot strained and the twists telegraphed themselves, Hall stayed precise. He had to do something almost no actor is asked to do, which is be empty and compelling at the same time. Dexter is, by his own description, hollow, a person performing humanity from the outside, and Hall had to play that hollowness while keeping you fascinated and even fond. The little tells, the slightly too practiced smile, the way the warmth never quite reaches the eyes, the flicker of confusion when a genuine feeling sneaks up on him, all of that is consistent from the first episode to the last. Whatever you think of any given season, his work is the floor the whole thing stands on, and the floor never gave way. Then there's the matter of Miami Metro, which I keep promising to come back to, so here we are. I said much earlier that the police department Dexter works for is, with great affection, one of the least effective investigative units in the history of fictional law enforcement, and across all 8 seasons that holds remarkably true. A serial killer works in their own building, processing blood evidence for years, and they never catch him through their own competence. The people who get closest are almost never the ones following procedure. They're the ones who feel something is wrong, a gut sense, a prickle of instinct, and even they tend to die or get discredited before they can act on it. In any real version of this, of course, a forensic analyst with Dexter's access and Dexter's habits would have been caught within a single season. Fingerprints, timelines, the sheer statistical improbability of one man being adjacent to so many deaths. But the show needs Dexter both meticulous and exposed, and so Miami Metro has to be just blind enough to keep him free. And honestly, once you make peace with it, it becomes part of the charm. You stop asking how they keep missing it and start enjoying the audacity of how openly he hides. Another constant is the villain as mirror structure, which we've now seen play out 8 times in 8 different ways, so it's worth naming plainly. Almost every season pairs Dexter with an antagonist who reflects some specific part of him back at himself. The brother who shows him what he'd be without the code, the agent, and the soldier who represent the law and the instinct that could undo him, the friend who wants to share the work and corrupts it, the family man who's mastered the double life Dexter's failing at, the survivor who picks up his darkness and then sheds it, the killer who shares his exact nature without apology, the zealot trapped in a compulsive cycle just like his own, even the woman who helped invent him. The show kept finding new facets of Dexter to externalize and put across the table from him, and that's not a coincidence. It's the basic engine of the whole series. Dexter never really fights other people. He fights versions of himself over and over, and what he learns or fails to learn from each one is the actual story underneath the crime plots. And then there are the smaller, lovely constants. The sun-bleached look of Miami, which the show uses so cleverly, because there's something deeply unsettling about all this darkness happening under that relentless, bright, tropical light. Most crime shows hide their horrors in shadow and rain. Dexter does it at noon, by the water, in board shorts, and that contrast never stops being effective. There's the boat, the slice of life, his strange little sanctuary, and his disposal method all in one. There's the opening title sequence, which turned an ordinary morning routine, shaving, frying an egg, grinding coffee, into something quietly menacing. All those everyday actions filmed like small acts of violence. There's the recurring presence of Harry, the imagined father, a constant across every season as Dexter's internal voice of the code. These textures don't change with the ranking. They're the furniture of the show, the things that make any episode of Dexter instantly recognizable as Dexter, and they're part of why even the weaker seasons still feel like home. And I'd add Miami itself to that list of constants because the city is almost a character in its own right across all 8 seasons. The show makes a real meal of the place, the heat, the neon, the marinas, the Cuban food, the endless sunshine baking down on a city full of secrets. It's a setting that feels alive and specific in a way a lot of crime shows never bother with. And it does important work because Miami's brightness and ease and pleasure-seeking sit in such pointed contrast to what Dexter actually is. There's a kind of irony in a serial killer thriving in a city built around relaxation and good times, hiding his darkness in the most relentlessly cheerful place imaginable. The city never stops being beautiful, even as terrible things happen in it. and that contrast is baked into the show's whole identity. Whatever the season, you always know exactly where you are the moment the picture comes up. You're in Dexter's Miami, and nowhere else looks quite like it. One last constant I'd be sad not to mention is the humor, because people forget how funny Dexter is. Not in a jokey sitcom way, but in the dry, deadpan running commentary of a man trying to decode normal human behavior from the outside and getting it slightly wrong. Dexter's internal narration is full of this. His bafflement at small talk, his careful study of how much enthusiasm a birthday cake is supposed to generate, his flat observations about the people around him. There's a whole comic register in watching the most dangerous man in Miami be utterly defeated by an office party or a parenting decision. And the show needs that humor, because without it, the relentless darkness would be unbearable. The lightness is what makes the heaviness survivable, both for Dexter and for us watching. It's a delicate balance, and the good seasons hold it beautifully, letting you laugh at Dexter's social fumbling one minute and feel the floor drop out the next. Even the weaker seasons mostly kept that tonal dexterity, that ability to be macabre and warm and wry all at once, which is a genuinely hard thing to do and a big part of why the show never curdled into pure grimness. I suppose what I'm getting at is that the gap between the best season and the worst, which felt so important while we were counting down, starts to look smaller when you step back and notice how much DNA they all share. The theme just came through more clearly in some than others, and with that in mind, let's settle into the last stretch of the night. So there it is, all 8 seasons, bottom to top. Season 8, then 6, then 3, then 5, then 7, then 2, then 1, and Season 4 at the summit. And now that we've laid them all out next to each other, I want to spend a little time before we say goodnight thinking about what a ranking like this actually is, because I don't think it's quite what it looks like on the surface. When you rank the seasons of a show you love, it feels like you're judging them, sorting them into winners and losers, deciding which ones earn their place and which ones let the side down. But I've never really believed that's what's happening. What you're actually doing is mapping your own relationship with the thing. The order isn't a verdict on the show, it's a record of how the show made you feel season by season. And that's a far more personal and far more forgiving sort of document. Your list and mine would probably differ in a few places, and neither of us would be wrong, because we're not measuring some fixed quality out there in the world. We're describing what stayed with us. And here's the thing I keep coming back to. These 8 seasons aren't really competitors. I line them up tonight as if they were, because that's the game we agreed to play. But it's a slightly artificial game. They're not 8 separate things fighting for a trophy. They're 8 chapters of one long story about one strange, lonely man. And a chapter near the end being weaker than a chapter near the beginning isn't a failure so much as it's the natural shape of a very long story told over many years by changing hands. Stories get tired. People who make them move on, and new people come in with new ideas, some of which work and some of which don't. The wonder isn't that Dexter declined. The wonder is that it stayed as good as it did for as long as it did, and that even in its weaker years, it never stopped being worth the time. I mentioned right at the start that the show's quality tracked closely with who was steering it, and I want to land on that gently rather than as a complaint, because I think there's something genuinely instructive in it. A long story needs someone at the center who knows, deep in their bones, what the story is about. Not the plot, the point. When that clarity is there, every choice serves it, and even the smaller seasons feel like they belong. When that clarity gets fuzzy, the show can still produce great individual moments, a church doorway, a clever reveal, but they stop adding up to something. The difference between the top of this list and the bottom isn't really talent or budget or actors, it's clarity of purpose. And I find that oddly comforting because it's true of almost anything people make together over a long time. It's true of a lot more than television. Something else worth saying while we're being honest about what a ranking really is. This list isn't fixed, not even for me. I've ranked these seasons differently at different points in my life, and I suspect I will again. There were years when season 2 sat at the very top for me because I was in the mood for tension and dread and the pure mechanical thrill of a man being hunted. There were years when season 5 climbed higher than most people would put it, because I happened to be going through something and its quiet story about rebuilding after loss landed exactly where I needed it to. The show doesn't change, but we do, and a ranking is really just a snapshot of who you were when you made it. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, the middle of this list would look a little different. If you ask me again in 5 years, it'll probably have shifted once more. That's not a flaw in the exercise, it's the whole point of it. We bring ourselves to the things we love, and they give us back something slightly different each time depending on what we're carrying. And there's a small irony I keep turning over, which is that we're using a show about a man who can never quite rest as a way to help ourselves fall asleep. Dexter never gets peace. That's his whole tragedy, really, from the first episode to the last. He's always performing, always managing, always one careless moment away from losing everything, and even in his happiest stretches, there's a tension underneath that never fully releases. He is a man who cannot put the work down. And yet here we are, using his story as the thing that lets us put our own work down for the night, that lets the day's worries go quiet enough for sleep to come. There's something gentle in that, I think. Whatever you're carrying tonight, whatever didn't get finished or didn't go right, you get to set it down for a while. Dexter never could, but you can, and maybe that's part of why a story like this is oddly soothing to drift off to. It reminds you, without ever saying so, that rest is a thing you're allowed to have. There's a particular pleasure in rewatching a show like this, knowing where it all goes, that I think is worth naming as we wind down, because it's probably why a lot of us end up putting it on at night in the first place. When you already know the whole shape of the story, the tension stops being about what happens and becomes something gentler, a kind of recognition. You notice the small things you missed the first time, the early hints, the quiet setups, the way a throwaway moment in season 1 rhymes with something devastating in season 4. You get to appreciate the craft rather than be gripped by the suspense. And there's a comfort in returning to characters you already know, in spending an evening with people whose fates are already sealed, because there's nothing left to be anxious about. You can just be in their company. That's a big part of why a familiar show makes such good company at this hour. The work of worrying is already done. All that's left is the warmth of the familiar, the pleasure of a story you know by heart, unfolding again exactly as it always does. There's something restful in that kind of certainty, in a world that mostly doesn't offer much of it. But I don't want to end on the seasons that wobbled. I want to end on the fact that this show, taken as a whole, gave us a character unlike almost anyone else on television. A man who was, by any honest definition, a monster, and who somehow had us rooting for him, worrying about him, grieving with him for 8 years. That's not a small thing. That took a central performance of real depth and a writing team, at least in the good years, willing to take the premise seriously rather than treating it as a gimmick. The fact that we can sit here and argue passionately about which season was the 4th best, the fact that the bottom of the list still has things in it worth defending, all of that is proof of how much the show earned from us. You don't rank a show you didn't love, you just forget it. If you'd like more of this sort of thing, I've got a few ideas knocking around that I'd genuinely love to get to. At some point, I want to do a whole separate ranking of the revival era, the newer chapters and the prequel and everything that's come since, because that's a whole conversation of its own, and it deserves its own evening, and it's a different beast in some ways, so it wouldn't have been fair to squeeze it in tonight. I'd also love to do a proper deep dive on that season 4 finale, just that 1 hour, pulling apart how it was built and why it lands as hard as it does. And one of these nights, I want to do every Dexter villain ranked, because we've only really touched on them tonight, and the show had some extraordinary ones, from the brother to the Trinity killer to that quietly tragic Ukrainian we spent some time with. I think there's a lovely long video in just sitting with each of them. And honestly, I could happily do an entire evening on Deborah alone, on what might be the most quietly heartbreaking arc in the whole series. A good person slowly destroyed by loving someone she should have turned in. So there's plenty of company still to come if you'd like it. This show has more corners to wander into than we could ever exhaust. Before I let you go, one last small thought, the kind that only really surfaces at this hour. I think the reason I keep coming back to this show, the reason I can rank it and pick at it and still love it completely, is that underneath all the blood and the plastic and the dark cleverness, it's secretly a show about loneliness, about a person who feels fundamentally separate from everyone around him, who's convinced he can only ever pretend at the warmth other people seem to have for free, and who spends 8 years quietly, desperately, mostly without admitting it, wanting to belong somewhere. And whatever else the show got right or wrong across its 8 seasons, it never stopped being honest about that ache. That's a more universal feeling than a show about a serial killer has any business tapping into. And yet it does, and I think that's the real reason it stuck to so many of us, not the kills, the longing underneath them. But that's all for tonight. Wherever you are right now, whatever hour it's gotten to while we've been talking, I hope this was a comfortable way to drift off. Maybe you made it all the way to season 4, or maybe you've been asleep since somewhere around the bottom of the list and you won't hear any of this, which again is honestly the goal. Either way, I'm glad you were here. Take care of yourself, get some proper rest, and the dark passenger can stay quiet for the night. Sleep well.